I absolutely hate writing. I find it incredibly difficult. I mean, it's worse than blood from a stone. If you put me in front of a blank screen and ask me to write something, it's never going to happen. What I do is I am fortunate in that my day job, peasant farming, means I'm outside. So thoughts just arise almost naturally, spontaneously. It's bits of writing in my head. So the bits of writing, as I'm going around, I write down on little bits of paper, stick in my pockets or in the sort of glove compartment of the tractor. And if you collect enough sticks, you can get a bonfire. Okay? If you collect enough small notes, you can eventually somehow work them into a book.
Hello, and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Jonathan Tulloch, and I'm delighted to be introducing to you today John Lewis-Stempel, farmer, historian, best-selling nature writer, and hopeless peasant.
That sounds very much like me.
Your own words.
By the way, yes, I know. I also seem to have exceeded the speed limit in jobs. About 5 or 6 there, but, you know.
There's lots to talk about. I'll just explain the format. We like to bring special guests to talk with us, but also to interact with the bank of archive material that the RLF has built up over the last decade. We've got a huge range of writers talking about the experience and process of writing, and we hope to really delve into the soil of creativity. So, is the last book you wrote really your last one, John?
I've said it's my last big book. I'd like to say major book, but that'd be that might be giving myself more laurels than I actually deserve. So I went into nature writing to do something quite specific. I wanted to talk about saving the last of England in terms of its countryside. I happen to be a farmer farming some of that last traditional countryside, and it seemed to me to be incredibly important that others knew about it, understood it, and why it was precious. So I have done 5 or 6 books on that kind of theme of the English countryside, small-scale farming, really, kind of measures in which people can be engaged in the countryside in terms of, cultivating the countryside, saving the countryside. There's a level at which one doesn't want to overstay one's welcome. It's not going to be my last book on nature. By the way, I would never, people say I'm a nature writer. I would never describe myself as a nature writer.
Right.
Okay, because nature is something other, self-regulatory, whereas I think what I really describe, talk about, write about is actually the cultivated nature, which is farmland. Because, one goes out and one looks at sort of the English landscape and it looks beautiful, and it is indeed beautiful. But it's largely beautiful because of the result of human intervention. Basically, 6,000 years ago, England was covered in trees. The Neolithic farmers rocked up and cut down the trees, which was essentially monoculture, and created an incredible variety of habitats. But they are farmed habitats. Even those bits of England which look wild, like Dorset heathland, the North Yorkshire moors, are in fact a type of farmland. That kind of cultivation of the landscape, that farming thing actually speaks to me. And that's really what I try to speak about. Of course, it has nature in it, yeah. It has nature in it. Or it used to have nature in it until it became sort of sunk beneath industrialized food production.
Right. But before we get onto that, that's led me to a question I've always wanted to ask you. Really serious question. What's your favourite breed of cattle?
That's actually, luckily, an easy one. I grew up surrounded by traditional Hereford cattle, but my favourite breed of cattle are called Red Poll, which are the cattle that I have farmed. And why do I like them? I like them because for me, there's no actual particular divide between wild animals and domestic animals. They are both worthy of respect. I think it's one of the shames of our time that domestic animals have become traduced. And I'm thinking of, I'll get a little bit controversial here, I'm thinking about those rewilders who call sheep sort of things like woolly maggots. All animals are deserving of respect. We should not traduce any animal. They're all actually incredibly important. And indeed, those animals that we sometimes traduce, such as sheep and cattle, because the cattle are terribly, they're the bad guys these days, aren't they, because of their methane emissions. But one also has to remember that those domestic animals are actually a part of our countryside. Indeed, those domestic animals created our countryside. I mean, the lovely grassy expanse of the South Downs exists because it's farmland which was grazed by sheep. And under proper systems, you actually increase biodiversity with domestic animals. And red poll cattle are very good, very good, absolutely everything one could want from them, which is conservation grazing, i.e., eating grass and fields in a way that actually promotes biodiversity. They are very good for humans in terms of, meat, milk production, and they're incredibly good company.
That thing about company, because I love shorthorns, which if you read All Creatures Great and Small and James Herriot, every page has got a shorthorn and they're coming back.
I know.
And they're so friendly, and,
But the thing is, of course, when we bring back these traditional breeds, which got lost because of the industrialization of agriculture and all the farm animals that came in were basically commercial breeds, essentially developed for intensive systems, we lost our traditional breeds, which happened to be very good at actually turning very little into very much. So our red poll cattle would thrive on absolutely nothing but fresh air, frankly, and produce a very high return of kind of meat and milk.
We remarked before we began that there was clover here on the wall. So let's imagine the studio's got a hillside of grazing cattle. And you say you don't like to be seen as a nature writer, but I think you've been described as England's finest nature writer.
Yeah, but I had to kill an awful lot of people to get that time. And to be honest, you'll be lucky to get out of here alive, by the way.
So let's have a look at how you became a nature writer. We'll look into that, how you started writing about nature. And we'll begin with a clip by Susan Fletcher on what inspired her to become a novelist.
I first began to make up stories in our downstairs loo. I was perhaps 7 or 8. There were no books involved in this, no paper, no pencils. Rather, there was simply a map of the world which my mother had pinned between the cistern and the coat rack, multicoloured, tatty and huge. 3 or 4 times a day, I'd have the opportunity to consider this map in private. I'd swing my legs and study its names and shapes and colours, and I'd start to imagine the people living in these other parts of the world. It was in the beginning only the southern hemisphere that I could see. It took several years' worth of growing before I could examine the world above the equator. Thus, I'd marvel at such names as Tierra del Fuego, Madagascar, the Great Australian Bight. I couldn't pronounce these places, but I could and did dream of what the houses might look like in them, of what it might be like to have all that cold ocean at one's feet or all those mountains overhead. I wondered what animals lived in the Falklands or Fiji, what clothes people wore. I wondered if Australians also had maps in their downstairs loo. Now, in my 40s, I have a far better idea of geography. I have been to many of the places that I imagined as a child, so that I've thought of my humming, nonchalant 8-year-old self when standing on New Zealand's most southerly tip. I've been to certain cities simply because I remember trying out their consonants and vowels to myself 30-odd years ago. I am older, but that's not to say that maps have lost any of their childhood wonder for me. In fact, the opposite is true. I'm a true cartophile these days, with shoeboxes full of Ordnance Survey maps, with antique maps of much-loved places, a world atlas that creaks when it opens, and, best of all, a globe. I love maps for their own intrinsic beauty, their colours and outlines. I love them for helping me to know a little more, but I love them most of all because they are sources for my best daydreams, even now. As in my childhood, I still imagine the lives in these far-flung places. I still picture cowboys or minarets or cresting whales or the northern lights. I imagine people coming home at the end of the day, barefoot or in snow boots, to a fireside. And I imagine the views they have from their windows, the drinks they pour or the losses they cradle. I imagine the loves and deaths of these lives. From this, stories begin in my head. My fingers will seek the keyboard or pen. In short, novels begin. And so, more than anything else, it is maps that inspire me, the geographical world and all its human lives.
So, John, that was a lovely, insightful view of the writer as a child, looking at the map on the toilet door. What was the map on your toilet door, so to speak?
I don't have a coherent answer as to why I have ended up as a nature writer with those rabbit ears around nature writer. As a child, I was both simultaneously incredibly advantaged and incredibly disadvantaged. The disadvantage being that my parents divorced when I was very young in the late 60s, which is very unusual. And I was actually brought up by my father, and we were very close. Therefore, by default, I was a lonely child, because I was also an only child. However, I had a life surrounded by dogs, geese, chickens, and sheep. And I lived in a very nice house with a very nice garden and orchards, and all my family farmed. And I found as I grew up, I had other siblings, and those were the animals around me, for instance, including my dogs. And I found quite an early age, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, and I'll probably have to edit it out afterwards, but I could speak dog. I could actually very much relate to all the animals around me. And in my childhood bedroom, I had house martins nesting. I don't want to give an impression of a kind of loner, like when I was at school, I was fine, played rugby and, it was great, and team sports and all that sort of stuff. But, necessarily had lots of time to myself. I learned to read very late, which is probably any psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever, is going to tell you as a result of childhood trauma. I think I was just absolutely lazy, frankly.
How old were you?
Well, I was past 7. And
wow.
Yeah, I know. I could not read. Okay. And I wanted a Thunderbirds EP. And my father said to me, you can have the Thunderbirds EP when you can read. Okay, so the next day I could read fluently. And this is not an exaggeration. Probably no surprise to people who are interested in kind of childhood psychology and language, like Piaget, because there's a kind of stage at which you naturally learn. It's very, very, very easy. But I did actually go from one day not being able to read to the next day being able to read. And then I became a voracious reader.
It could be you were bilingual if you were talking dog and cattle and
well,
all
yes,
of that.
but actually I think I'm trilingual,
right.
Because although I was sort of brought up in school to speak middle-class English, my grandparents actually were absolutely really strong dialect, okay? Impenetrable dialect. When, later on in life, I married and returned to Herefordshire with my wife. I mean, she was absolutely bemused because I could sort of go to the end of the garden, lean over the fence and talk to the neighbours in this incredibly strong dialect, which she couldn't understand. And she'd only ever known me speaking kind of like middle-class English,
Could you do a bit now? I love dialect.
Herefordshire dialect is incredibly high-pitched, okay? So it's something like... what's he doing then? But, it's very, very high-pitched, And my wife actually said to me, and please don't let this out into Herefordshire, okay? Because no one will ever talk to me again, She said, if I'd actually talked with a very local high-pitched accent, she would never have married me, However, I became an incredibly voracious reader. And I read all sorts of things. But what made the actual difference to my life was a school teacher, Mr. David, who introduced me to the books of B.B., Dennis Watkins Pitchford. Yes. My English master, Mr. David, at the age of 11, made us boys read B.B.'s 2 books about gnomes, Down the Bright Stream, okay, etc., and the Little Grey Men. And I think it's probably impossible to get 11-year-old boys to read books like that these days. But we all read it wrapped with attention. And what happened was, in the process of reading, I understood detail. That thing that B.B. says and has as a motto in all his books, and I can't quite remember it exactly, but the motto at the beginning of his books is, about shapes and sounds and colours. I saw them all. Ye who live, look out for them. And it was the detail. In reading these stories about gnomes, I could see the detail in the nature, like the roots of the oak above the brook. And I actually had my eye drawn to the detail of nature in a way that I really had never had before.
That's very noticeable in your writing, that the going within the root of the oak and going to that depth, that's very noticeable. So it's come from that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say my grandparents were also, in this level, an incredible influence on me. I spent quite a lot of my childhood with my grandparents, and they were really about the last of a kind of particular old-style farmer that was really, really, really connected to the land and to nature. And my grandmother would take me on for walks, and she would get me to smell the weather. What was the incoming weather?
That's great.
Incredible.
And given Herefordshire, I imagine it's going to be wet.
Yeah, okay, so fair enough. Most times she would guess it's going to be wet, and it was wet, and that's certainly the case. But she got me to do things like tell the time by the flowers. And she made corn dollies. She actually made corn dollies, not as a middle-class kind of, let's go to a class to learn how to make corn dollies. She just made corn dollies, frankly.
I want to continue this sense of place, how that's obviously important to you. So we'll listen now about another author who writes really well about the significance of place, and it's Rahul Berry, and they're talking about a tiny Welsh city of St. David's.
My sense of home and belonging is a complicated story, crossing multiple borders over the generations, India and Pakistan, Wales and England, Scotland, Ireland, and languages, Welsh, Sindhi, Hindi, Punjabi, one that is never easy to summarise nor the topic of this piece. While I've always identified most strongly with London, the city of my birth and formative years, there's only one place in the world where I can go and say with absolute certainty that my ancestors lived there consistently over hundreds of years. The city of Tyddewey, or St. David's in English, and the surrounding peninsula known as Dewisland. This is the spiritual capital of Wales, home of its patron saint, known to most as the smallest city in the UK, with an off-season population of under 2,000 that doubles or triples in the summer months. Its city status is due to its spectacular medieval cathedral, of which we have an unbeatable view from the garden of the house we still stay in. This house, Arosfa, once belonged to my great-grandmother, Nana. Stories of Nana, who used to brew potato wine, cooked a mean cawl, and had a cupboard called the Tuth Dan Star, hole under the stairs, into which misbehaving children would be banished, are just as much a part of what I find inspiring about this place as the fantastical tales of Saints David, Justinian, and Non, whose legendary acts are etched into the landscape. I'm just as astonished by the thought that not many generations ago my ancestors were tenant farmers for whom English was a distant second language, as I am by tales of miracles and enchantment in what is truly a miraculous and enchanted landscape. Of course, the landscape of this part of the Pembrokeshire National Park has inspired artists, saints, and scholars over the millennia, and my 4 decades of coming here mean that practically every inch of cliff, every beach, every rock pool and hedgerow speaks to me in a way that almost nowhere else does. For while the London of my early years is almost unrecognisable now, this outpost in the Irish Sea has hardly changed at all, and yet the effect it has on me is always one of renewal. As a literary translator, inspiration doesn't always feel as necessary as it might do to a novelist or a poet. The mechanical aspect of this kind of writing means I can often get a bit of work done even in a spare 5 minutes on the train or between meetings. It may not be my best work, but it's always something I can build upon. My Brazilian colleague Caetano Galindo once spoke about the best remedy for a fiendish translation conundrum being a simple stroll, when weather or lethargy make that impossible or undesirable where I live in centre of Cardiff. Sometimes all it takes is a mental trip to the cliffs and beaches and valleys of Dewisland. So convinced am I of the superiority of Pembrokeshire's beaches that trips to genuinely exotic coastal locations from South India to southern Spain and Portugal are always slightly marred by a sneaking suspicion that, were it not for the warmer weather, there wouldn't be much to write home about. The beaches here are rugged, pristine, containing endless inlets and caves and rock pools. Porthlisky, only accessible by foot or by sea, is perhaps my favourite place to swim in the world. And those cliffs from St David's Head to Carvai fill me with existential dread and euphoria in equal measure. Indeed, sometimes I wonder if they're the same thing. There is, of course, the visceral element of fear when you're walking on a narrow bit of coast path, knowing that, hypothetically, certain death is only a hop away. But then there's also the feeling, equally liberating and oppressive, that, in comparison to the cliff face and the sea that pounds them day in and day out, you are less than nothing. It's the feeling that, as Herman Melville put it, when you are long gone, the great shroud of the sea will roll on as it rolled 5,000 years ago. Inspiration comes not only from such dread heights, but from the birds, sea creatures, insects and mammals that still populate the peninsula, and from the sense of groundedness and continuity I feel in this landscape. When I look across Gramsey Sound to Ramsey Island, Ynys y Dewi, David's Island in Welsh, I always think of my great-great-uncle, Tommy John, who used to swim cattle across this treacherous stretch of water from the mainland to the island. I think of Cymraeg, the main language of all my ancestors on this side of the family until quite recently, and how an earlier version it was almost certainly spoken before the Romans ever set foot on the island of Britain, perhaps 1,000 years before there was such a thing as the English language. So while I don't have the luxury of being able to clear up every translation conundrum, professional frustration, or lack of inspiration with an actual walk along the cliffs and beaches of Dewisland, I can do the next best thing, which is to travel there in my mind. Perhaps because I know it so well, I can evoke it mentally in a way I would struggle to do with most other places. Beyond the Welsh language poet Waldo Williams, little known outside of Wales and the language he wrote in, there is a surprising lack of writers who have knowingly taken inspiration from this landscape, save perhaps the pioneering nature writer and campaigner R.M. Lockley. It's more the terrain of visual art from painters such as John Nat Fisher and Graham Sutherland to contemporary ceramicists such as Adam Buick. Perhaps this is because so little of history with a capital H happened in this region. The Industrial Revolution that made the Welsh valleys the crucible of so much revolutionary action never came anywhere near here, nor did the Rebecca riots of 1843 quite stretch this far. The Normans occupied South Pembrokeshire early on. Centuries later, Henry VII was born in Pembroke Castle, but they left Welsh-speaking North Pembrokeshire well alone. The border between these two cultural worlds is still known by the Viking term landskap. Only the Nordic names of nearby islands, Skoma, Stockholm, Grassholm, give you any sense of turmoil and invasion happening in the vicinity. There's also the sinking of the lifeboat Gem in 1910, in which my great-great-great-uncle, count those greats, Henry Rowlands, perished. Surely a great story for a novel or a TV series. Perhaps Tiddewy is one of those places that can only be done justice through literature by following the edict of Patrick Kavanagh's poem Epic, in which Homer's ghost comments upon Kavanagh's description of a land dispute in his native county Monaghan that, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance. While my writing largely consists of turning the words of others into English, I feel sure that if or when I turn my hand to creative writing, this place will, in one way or another, make an appearance.
That was really interesting, and I don't think I'm going to need to give you a prompt, John, to talk about a sense of place.
Okay, so background. I think both my sets of parents arrived in Herefordshire in about, probably before the 1200s. So, yeah, I mean, do I feel a connection to place? I certainly do. And part of that is a kind of sense of heritage. I can look at the landscape and I can see the work of my forefathers and foremothers, because that's what the English countryside actually is. It's a work of beauty. It's a work of art, agriculture. So I don't just see the nature, well, that's important. I see the work, the farm work of my ancestors. I mean, every time I go home and I see that red clay soil, I sometimes feel you could just open up my arm with a knife and the blood coming out would be the same color as the soil, and the soil is the same color as my blood. But then that's not unusual, is it really? What's the Hebrew for man and earth? Well, it's almost the same word, aren't they? Adam. And that's very important to me, that kind of really intense connection. Okay, so I grew up in a place of absolute beauty because, Herefordshire in the 1970s effectively was the most bucolic expression of England you could possibly find. Small.
Controversial?
Controversial.
Cumbria.
Yes.
I'm from Cumbria.
Yeah,
so.
well, yeah. The thing is, you're going to get about 50 different. It was almost entirely on sport because it was so remote. The village school near where we farmed was actually, I think, the second most remote village school in England. When you think of a kind of, a picture of England, that kind of lovely hedge meadow, black and white cottages with roses around the door, hop yards. My grandparents were hop farmers. It was beautiful, but it was also the way of life. Okay. So, although I have a commitment to place, actually, let's just stop there a moment. Because, of course, this commitment to place is actually the essential of English nature writing, isn't it? Because English nature writing starts with Gilbert White, Natural History of Selborne, and that's what he did. He identified with place. That's what English nature writing is. I don't have the arrogance to say Welsh or Scottish. I don't do that. Okay, I don't want anyone to think I'm saying English in place of all those other places. I'm just talking about the place that I happen to be. So English nature writing is very, 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 very specifically about place. So you get that with BB, you get that with Edward Thomas. And it is that commitment to place. I mean, Gilbert White called it watching narrowly, okay, in two senses. Very close detail on nature, but also very close detail on his parish because he was a reverend. And, we had this amazing thing in England where all these parson naturalists existed. So that's very important. And I am aware of the influence on me of that sense of commitment to place in terms of, should we say, writing about nature. But I am also passionately committed to a sense of time. Because for me, Herefordshire in the 1970s, when it was absolutely loud with wildflowers, bright with birdsong, with traditional family farming, was in a sense, I would not say it was an idyll or an Eden, but it seems to me to be actually really rather wonderful. And in that were the most amazing kind of characters, proper country characters who really existed in that place, such as a guy who worked for my father, Tom. He was brewing probably like hundreds of gallons of illegal cider. My grandparents' neighbour was an incredibly wonderful, bone-thin, aristocratic woman who would, if I walked past her on the lane, but once she jumped out, she'd always jump out from her herbaceous border, jump out and scare the life of me. And she once jumped out and caught me by the arm when I was 9. And she said, "John, always beware of people who don't have dog hair on their sofa." So the thing is, those kind of characters, it's not just, we need to red list the kind of, the birds are disappearing, the flowers are disappearing. But in a sense, I think we need to red list some of the kind of countryside people.
I totally agree. I live and have lived for years in North Yorkshire now, and my in-laws are in the agri community. And I often say, and I really feel this, there's a gentleness and a rootedness and just a real kindness amongst people that I don't know whether you would find it in a city.
Sorry. I mean, I absolutely hated living in a city. I had to go to a city because I went to university. And then I met my wife at university, and she's from London. Okay. It took me about 12 years to actually persuade her to actually go and live in the country. I mean, as I say, we sort of joke how to drag her back by her long raven hair to my cave in Herefordshire. But what I think one can say is that, we need a countryside that involves working people, that involves people who live there, building a kind of sense of community. Because so often, I think these days, the prospects proffered are rather, I know I have controversial views on rewilding because believe me, I want the restoration of nature. I mean, that's essentially one of the reasons I write is I want the restoration of nature, particularly in farmland. Rewilding seems to me, giving all over to the wolves and the beavers and the trees, a bit of a problem because what's the human role there? Well, the human role is basically to become homo touristicus. You can only go and view it. You can't actually participate in it. So I would like myself to have a kind of resurrection of peasant England. We never talk about land reform enough in this country. We never talk about people getting back to small farms or to allotments. So I'd like also to remember that when we're talking about the countryside, we need to remember that there are people involved. And perhaps we should have more people involved.
A land reform that would return the land to a larger number of farmers and labourers.
Well, I mean, it's extraordinary. I'll put my historian's hat on now.
Hang fire for a second.
Right.
We'll listen to another writer from our wonderful archive, Chris Arthur, who's talking about the relationship between the writer and nature.
The 19th century Scottish essayist Alexander Smith once said that the world is everywhere whispering essays, and one need only be the world's amanuensis. For me, the most intriguing whispers, those I want to eavesdrop on and write about, are the ones I hear emanating from nature. I've been lucky. I grew up with unspoiled countryside close at hand. Both at home and at school, I came into contact with people who were passionate about birds and flowers and insects, and eager to share their knowledge of the natural world. Later, I had the opportunity of working as warden on a nature reserve. All of this has fed into my writing. If you look at the titles of some of my essays, it's clear that birds are often the source of the whispering I try to capture in my writing. The last corncrake, kingfishers, swan song. How many words do you need to describe a wood pigeon? Waxwings. But nature offers all kinds of other prompts as well. I've also written under such titles as Meditation on the Pelvis of an Unknown Animal, How to See a Horse, Chestnuts, Mistletoe, Fuchsia, and In the Stomach of a Termite. Birds, insects, plants, animals, bits of bone, all of them whisper in the way that Alexander Smith suggests. The problem is that once you stop to listen, these whispers are of symphonic complexity. Catching them isn't the simple matter of note-taking that Smith's scribal metaphor suggests. I'm well aware that in my efforts to be the world's amanuensis, I can only convey a tiny fraction of nature's wonders. My books are as much records of an amanuensis failing to catch the world's whispered essays as they are transcriptions of the incredible things they say. But I think such failure can be justified by putting a comment of pioneer conservationist John Muir's alongside Smith's. When we try to pick out anything by itself, says Muir, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. The more I write, the greater my sense of such hitching. Whether it's a fallen leaf or the strange call of a corncrake, a tropical driftseed or a whale's tooth, each of nature's whispers leads into intricate mazes of connection, meaning, and association. I've come to share J.A. Baker's view, expressed in his great book, The Peregrine, that the hardest thing of all to see is what is really there. Baker's study of these beautiful raptors shows the folly of thinking that they surrender easily to the writer's pen. Even his masterful prose only allows us to catch glimpses of them. It provides a consummate set of variations on the theme of Peregrine. But what sparks the variations is uncatchable. The variations could be continued without end. It's what escapes the words on the page that keeps me writing about birds and leaves and insects, rather than any deluded sense of being able to give definitive accounts. But I like to think that I can at least point to, even if I can't fully transcribe, the astonishing things that nature whispers all around me.
Oh, that's very good. Thanks very much to Chris Arthur there. And thanks, Chris, for letting us hear the strange call of the corncrake, which I seem to remember, John, was one of the things that really struck you when you were a child, hearing a corncrake and something that's maybe disappeared.
I honestly think I probably heard the last corncrake in Herefordshire. So I went out into the wheat field behind my grandparents' house, and in those days, wheat fields were rather different to wheat fields now, which was that the wheat was about 4-5 feet high, and it was full of flowers, whereas it's 2 feet high now because it's been dwarfed so it can cope with the weight of the spray of the chemicals. And I was going along as a little child, and I came to a kind of space in the wheat, and the bird came towards me, and we stared at each other, and it disappeared. But I had noticed for several days there'd been this bird making this extraordinary noise, which I could only imitate by running my fingers along a comb. So I asked my grandparents what it was, and they said it was a corncrake. And I think I probably saw the last corncrake in Herefordshire. And, it's that Wordsworth thing, isn't it? About spots of time, what impacts on your head, and locates. And that very much located in my head. And that moment did, 20, 30 years later, 30 years later, become a kind of prompt to start writing about why we need to save the nature in the farmed countryside of England.
I really think that thing of just being somewhere is really interesting. Is there a good marriage between your sense of well-being and being out in nature, and you're expressing it, you're writing about it? Is there a good fit for that? Do you feel happy as you write?
I absolutely hate writing. I find it incredibly difficult. I mean, it's worse than Blood from a Stone.
Ow.
I probably shouldn't have said this, should I?
No, I think...
This is my Gerald Ratner moment.
No, read the word again.
I find it incredibly difficult. So if you put me in front of a blank screen and ask me to write something, it's never going to happen. Never going to happen. What I do is I am fortunate in that my day job, peasant farming, means I'm outside. So thoughts just arise almost naturally, spontaneously, and bits of writing in my head. So the bits of writing, as I'm going around, I write down on little bits of paper, stick in my pockets or in the sort of glove compartment of the tractor. Mm-hmm. And if you collect enough sticks, you can get a bonfire. Okay? If you collect enough small notes, you can eventually somehow work them into a book. That's what I do. Okay?
Embroider them all together.
Embroider them all together. But put me in front of a blank screen and I panic. I just absolutely panic.
I think I'm
not.
There.
I don't think I'm a natural writer.
They say easy writing makes for hard reading. So maybe hard writing makes for easy writing.
I'm not sure, but I don't do both. I don't think... I mean, I am aware, because it is pointed out to me, that I have a slightly deliberately complicated style. I mean, sometimes people who are generous call it lyrical, okay? Sometimes people who are kind call it things like Platoresque, as in the Spanish silver work. It is wrought. I think it's intentionally wrought because I'm trying to describe not just sight, but feeling and sound. And, I am aware that I deliberately make it rich.
Right. The next thing that we're going to move on to, and this is important because John was telling us as soon as he got to the studio about his adventures in Soho in the 1980s, in his life before he was a writer, between farming and writing, and as a journalist. Before then, we'll hear Debjani Chatterjee, who is writing about other jobs.
My parents always said to me that writing should not be a career. They were convinced that if I stuck to just writing, then I'd probably be starving in some garret. So they felt that I should do a proper job and write in my spare time. So to begin with, I believed this. And so I had many different jobs. I remember in my student days as an undergraduate in Egypt, the American University in Cairo, I had a student job in the library there. And then after coming over to the UK, I was teaching in Manchester at Disbury College of Education. I was teaching comparative religion. And then after my PhD, I was working in the steel industry for a while. I left the steel industry, went into community relations. For 10 years, I was director of Sheffield Racial Equality Council. And I was also teaching in adult education at the university. And I don't really regret any of this, because I do believe that life experience is very important for any writer. Even the bad experiences. Certainly the time in the steel industry was challenging for me, because I encountered a lot of racism and sexism. And I must say, I didn't find steel an exactly very exciting product to be selling.
Well, steel has its uses, I suppose. But I can't picture you, John, as starving in a garret when you can be working as a journalist in 1980 Soho.
As I probably expressed, I'm probably the world's most reluctant writer, and it never actually occurred to me anyone could be a writer. I mean, I to say I don't come from a literary background would be understate the truth. So, I mean, my life has been slightly dictated by the fact I fell in love with my wife, as I explained earlier. So I had to try and find gainful employment. Well, I did 2 degrees. Actually, I might have done 3, come to think about it. So I did the kind of perpetual student thing, and then, what do you do with a degree in history? You kind of end up, doing all sorts of things, really. But I did actually end up at one point being marvelously, I think I was the researcher to the researcher to the researcher for World in Action TV program. Basically making the tea, that sort of thing. But I actually started off kind of reviewing books, which I think is probably a fairly traditional way in. So I used to review crime books for Time Out. And then probably simultaneously, I was researcher to the researcher for World in Action. Quite a lot of 1980s media seemed to be take place in pubs.
Any pubs in particular?
Every pub in particular, right. I think, is probably the answer to that. It was a very different kind of life to now, because basically there was much more money in kind of writing and magazines and things, So it was much easier. But it never occurred to me that one could actually, be a writer, even sometimes even getting some money from it. That was a bit of a kind of revelation, frankly.
So you were doing the reviewing. Where did it go from there?
I have written under a number of pseudonyms, which no one knows.
Are you gonna...
And now you all do.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to tell you what they are.
Quite wise.
I never really had the kind of confidence to do it. I thought it was really writing books was actually for somebody else, yeah. I was always the support act. So for years, I actually edited anthologies of other people's writing. And I can't even now remember how the hell I got on to do my own first book. Well, actually, I can. It's because the issues concerned were so important to me that I felt I needed to express them. One was the wildlife, which is my first so-called nature book, okay? And that was very much about how nature heals one. That was one thing. And the other one was, I did a book about junior officers in the First World War called 6 Weeks. And again, that was a book where I felt compelled to tackle what I thought were erroneous viewpoints, wrong views. So in fact, now I think about it, what really propelled me to actually writing my own books was, I suppose I thought I needed to say something to address what I thought were wrongs.
I think that's really good summation of the author's vocation. And talking about vocations, I'd like us to listen to our last clip, which is a reflection on faith. And I bring this up because you mentioned before about the Reverend Gilbert White. And I think also you've said somewhere about that you may be one of the last Christian nature writers in England. So let's listen to Donny O'Rourke, who's actually celebrating a pagan festival. And then we'll talk about that.
With all due respect to Vivaldi and pizza, maybe 4 seasons aren't enough. Chinese poets of the Tang dynasty had an extra one in which to feel even more sad. German ecological efficiency came up with Vorfrühling, Vorspring, which has nothing to do with cars. Such a preview of or trailer for spring could come in guy handy in Scotland, where winter is given far too long a run. In fact, the Celts, who did some of their finest Celting round a misty loch in Hallstatt, a suspiciously Scottish-looking region of Austria, believed in an optimistically early kick-off for spring. This festival they called Imbolc. As a devout Hiberno Scot, observant in every sense, I hold with this custom, whose patroness worked both sides of the spiritual street as pagan deity and Christian saint. Bridget's feast falls on the 1st of February, when, with a little luck and a lot of prayer, the snowdrops and crocuses will already have raised their heads and our morale. The nights are fair drawing out. Light isn't just a memory and a hope in a country that half hibernates for half the year, but a literally luscious presence, as a low sun pits its rays against the rain, charming and chiding January's glower, with the bashful glare of an incipient semi-season. If the year were a book, Bridget would be writing winter's epilogue and a preface to spring. Sleet and snow, however, can remain impervious to her blandishments. It's windy and wet, the worst weather yet in a wintry week. The weatherman's grim, according to him, the outlook's bleak. But there's a little more light, brighter each night, spring is on the way. The first bud or two will have broken through by St. Bridget's Day.
Thanks, Donny. That was lovely. I've always liked St. Bridget myself, and that's a really interesting thing about the mini season, the extra season. What do you think, John? How does faith or values or religion, how is it important for you?
I think it's absolute arrogance to think that we humans who wandered out of Africa, even though the questions to be asked, let alone the answers, I think I dislike the fact that we even call ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens, which is doubly wise humans. If we were so wise, why are we destroying the planet? I distrust in some ways the kind of absolute precepts and certitudes of those kind of sciences that say, there is nothing more than that we can see. I probably think and feel, because isn't feeling important? It's great to use one's intellect, but maybe we should also use our kind of feelings. And I feel that the universe is a little more designed than it is by kind of accident. What that actually leads to, I think, in practice for me is that I've become a very strong believer in the kind of democracy, equality of animals. See, I get very concerned. This is obviously another of my missions, okay? I get very concerned about the fact that everyone's wild about beavers. Everyone's wild about wolves. But it's not just sort of getting a kind of particular thing about certain charismatic mammals. But are those animals more important, for instance, than eels, which are disappearing? Should there not be a certain sort of reverence for the common small things, such as the wood pigeon, which is frankly the most probably, probably the commonest bird you're going to find. But it does something absolutely extraordinary, which is it actually produces a kind of milk to feed its young, which is very akin to mammalian milk, but it's a bird. So this is going back to the kind of, writing I'm trying to do these days, is that kind of attention to reverence for small things, because we're sort of forgetting them, maybe overlooking them in a passion for, wild and charismatic animals. So what that actually means for me in terms of kind of, what's one of the kind of, aspects of my faith religion? Well, I think all animals are equally important. And I think they should all be given their due in their reverence. And I don't think as humans we do that, but I wish that we did.
All creatures, great and small.
That's exactly what I was going to go on to say.
So if, say, you had some input into, like, the creation of the world on the 7 days, shall we say, what bird and what animal would you create first? What's the one that's closest to you? What bird and what animal?
Okay, the bird's easy. Okay, I think it's a terrible, and this is I'm beginning to get uncomfortable in how revealing this talk is actually becoming, because I actually think the bird one chooses actually reveals an awful lot of one's personality. It's a kind of Rorschach test, okay? So the bird is easy. It's the moorhen. Skitty the moorhen, a shy bird that lurks around at the edge of the pond, and I'm doing myself really no favours at all here. But do you remember that Jonah Louis song, You'll Always Find Me in the Kitchen at Parties?
Yes.
Right, well, there you are, Skitty and me. Skitty being Herefordshire dialect. It's a pity we've lost dialect, isn't it?
So Skitty is moorhen?
Skitty is Herefordshire dialect for a moorhen.
Right.
I regret the passing of those kind of local names. We got obsessed with being kind of cosmopolitan, but sometimes local is kind of quite good too. So Skitty is Herefordshire dialect for a moorhen.
You'd have to have that high-pitched Herefordshire...
Skitty.
Yeah,
exactly. Skitty the moorhen. I don't have a ranking system which says wild is good and domestic is bad. So for my animal, it's fortuitous for me that in that same moment, dogs and sheep both came onto the earth at my creation. I love dogs and sheep pretty much equally, and I'm very much in tune with Saint Perpetua, which is basically that heaven is basically a shepherd's paradise.
Right, okay.
Because there was a huge, as you probably know, discussion in the medieval church. Do animals go to heaven? Okay.
That's always gets asked,
so
doesn't it?
Two things, okay. Basically, if you ask me, if dogs don't go to heaven, it's not heaven, and I'm not going. The other thing is, according to St. Perpetua, who's against the kind of Augustine viewpoint, St. Perpetua was absolutely insistent that heaven is basically a kind of shepherd's paradise, okay? Whereas, shepherds and sheep are all living lovely, in a lovely kind of harmony together. Works for me.
That sounds pretty good to me. Look, thanks very much, John. That was a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure people listening will be fascinated. So thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.